Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. It's Science Fiction Saturday again. And I've got a trilogy of movies I think are very underrated. They're all from more or less the 21st century. They're all by the same director. Some of the writing was by the same guy who was also the director. And it was a breakout movie for a big star whose star has kind of diminished a little bit, but is still an interesting franchise actor. Of course, I'm talking about the Riddick trilogy with Vin Diesel, Pitch Black, the Chronicles of Riddick, and Riddick from, he's trying to say from memory, 2000, 2004, and 2013 respectively. The director I'm talking about is David Twohy. And David Twohy's had an interesting career as a genre director. I don't think he gets enough credit for it because he does some really good, entertaining, medium budget science fiction movies that really don't get enough love. He did things like The Arrival with Charlie Sheen, which is quite an interesting little quirky science fiction film. And at the end of the 20th century, along with Ken and Jim Wheat, a pair of brothers who were screenwriters, David Twohy developed a project which would become Pitch Black. There were a lot of changes to it over the development period, and they had to find a star to play Richard B. Riddick, a murderer who is imprisoned aboard a ship traveling between star systems. So they went with a guy who had a fairly minor role in Saving Private Ryan back in 1998, Vin Diesel, Mark Vincent, to use his real name. And this was the breakout role for Vin Diesel. It's the role that got him the gig a year later doing the first Fast and Furious movie. And it's the one that really started his career in a big way. And Pitch Black's an interesting film. A spaceship where the whole crew and passengers are in cryosleep accidentally slips into the tail of a comet while passing through a planetary system. The micrometeoroids puncture the hull, the ship gets damaged, and they've got to crash land on an unknown planet where it is always sunny because the planetary system has 3 stars, and the 3 stars are constantly in the sky. It's a little bit like that Asimov story Nightfall, but with much better monsters. The surviving crew member is a woman called Fry, played by Radha Mitchell, who is feeling guilty because in order to save the ship as it was crash landing, she was about to jettison the passengers. She was told not to by her captain, played by an Australian actor who had an interesting career and still does, in fact, Simon Burke. His name's Owens. And Simon Burke was the star of Fred Skepsi's movie The Devil's Playground back in 1976, which was about a kid growing up in a Catholic boarding school. And the reason you get an Australian actor playing the star, and the reason you get a supporting cast that's full of Australian actors, is it was actually filmed in Coober Pedy in South Australia, an opal mining town where most of the people live underground, and the surface of the ground out of Coober Pedy is a really hot, parched desert most of the time, because when they filmed this film there, it was winter. And it was pretty cold. It gets pretty cold in the Australian desert in winter. Not North American cold, but cold enough to go below 0 centigrade on a regular basis. And by the way, Coober Pedy lost their drive-in movie screen and the storm has now just been resurrected. It's one of the few towns left in Australia that's got an active drive-in movie theatre. So thumbs up to Coober Pedy. Supporting cast is really good in this. I like the supporting cast. You've got Keith David playing an imam. He's taking a group of young Muslim boys to Hajj. They go into New Mecca. They never tell you what happened to old Mecca, but they go into New Mecca. And Keith David's just Keith David. He's good. Cole Hauser playing Johns, a bounty hunter who's pretending to be a law officer who has captured Riddick and is taking him back for the bounty. We also have Claudia Black playing Shazza, an Australian woman whose partner Zeke, played by John Moore, is an Indigenous Australian. So there's an incredibly multicultural and multi-layered world that this movie creates in this small spaceship. There's also a character played by Lewis Fitzgerald who's an antique dealer and a smuggler as well, and he gets a couple of beautiful grace moments. His death scene is chef's kiss good. The survivors find their way to a mining station with a dropship there, but they don't have any fuel cells for the dropship. So they decide to scavenge the fuel cells out of their crashed ship and take them to the dropship. But there is other life on this planet. And the surface of the planet is teeming with life. It's got some very predatory. The tunnels underground are full of a predatory flying species, which is a cross between a velociraptor and a flying axe. In the lore of the movie, they're called bioraptors. It's never mentioned in the movie, but the background stuff and the lore that's been created since this movie came out They're called bioraptors, and they only come out in the dark, which happens once every 22 years. They're kind of like cicadas. Cicadas bury themselves underground for 17 years, then come out and do everything they need to do. And the bioraptors is every 22 years. In the station, they find an orrery. And when they look at the orrery, they find out that there's going to be an eclipse soon. And the larger planet that this planet is the moon of is going to eclipse the planet for a prolonged period of time. There's a whole bunch of other stuff about the planet which we get for texture. The planet has a lower oxygen level than the Earth, so people get a little bit winded quite easily. And the light of this planet changes depending on which of the suns is in the ascendancy at the time. So you get a very pale yellow look for one of the suns and a blue look for one of the other suns. And a very washed out look for most of the time, because this planet is bathed in light. It's quite hot. It's got fairly low oxygen. And the suns are constantly up, but the suns are different. So one of them's bluer than the other, which obviously means it's a larger sun. And the other two suns are a much yellower light, which means they're probably G-class. And Riddick escapes. Riddick is a Furian. I'm going to go to the lore of this movie and the trilogy. Riddick is a Furian. It's a kind of humans that live on a particular planet which has been lost. In that way, it's a little bit like Earl Dumarest in the E.C. Tubb Dumarest novels. He's a human being who's looking for his lost home planet. Furians have unusual qualities. First off, Riddick's eyes are different. He can see in the dark. And in the first movie, he tells people that he had it done when he was in an underground prison, and he gave a guy a whole bunch of packets of smokes, and he got an eye job so that he could see in the dark. It's not the truth. We get that retrofitted in the second and third movies, that he's actually a Furian, and Furians have the ability to see in the dark, which is why Riddick is wearing shades most of the time. He needs them to be able to see in bright sunlight. The other qualities of Furians are they're very strong, they're very resilient. They heal really quickly from injuries, not like Wolverine quickly, but plausibly quickly. And Riddick's skill set is he understands and watches and learns behavior, whether it's the behavior of the individuals around him or whether it's the behavior of animals. And whether it's human behavior or animal behavior, Riddick's very good at studying, understanding, and then using the behavior of humans or animals to survive. His whole impetus is survival. He will help you as long as you don't get in his way to survive. We will see Riddick working with the people who survived this spaceship crash, but his first impetus is always his own survival. So in a sense, he's a selfish character, incredibly survival focused. And we see him doing some interesting interactions with not only Fry and the Imam, but there's a young boy called Jack who's with them, who's got some unusual qualities. Riddick likes Jack, and Riddick forms a bond with Jack in a very interesting way. And Jack decides to emulate Riddick, and Jack shaves their hair and finds some old goggles to wear to emulate Riddick and to basically mimic Riddick in order to survive. So comes the eclipse, and the bioraptors start pouring out of these holes in the ground, and they start attacking the people, and they start killing each other. They're obviously mating in some ways. It's basically a feeding frenzy across the whole planet while the planet is in darkness. And all throughout the three movies, there are a few things that are done really well. The sense of these alien planets is really well evoked, and I like the way they do it. The color values tell us we're not on Earth. The landscapes, and they use the natural landscape around Cooperpedia in the first movie. You've got the ring system of the planet around which the planet they're on is orbiting. You've got auroral displays in the sky. You've got all sorts of things that give you a really good sense that this is not home. The acting is really good. I like Claudia Black as Shazza. She later on went on to do other things like Farscape and became a very well-known and well-regarded voice actor as well, mostly for computer games. And Lewis Fitzgerald, good, solid Australian actor. Keith David as your mum is terrific. He turns up in the second film as well. And Cole Hauser as Johns, the bounty hunter, has some secrets as well. And in fact, we meet John's father in the third movie, and we find out that he has been hunting Riddick ever since the events of the first movie, which takes place 10 years before the third movie does. This is a good, solid science fiction adventure. It tries to get the science pretty much right. There are a couple of bits where you can have some quibbles about it, like having two ring systems around a planet that aren't on the same orbital plane, and a couple of things like that. But for the most part, they get the science more or less right. And the monsters they create are genuinely scary. The bioraptors, which we only ever see in flashes of light in the darkness, having a nighttime shoot with anything with a lot of computer-generated creatures in it, because they don't have to be photorealistic. They just have to be good enough to show up at the night, because the lack of light is a little more forgiving of your computer-generated creations than it would be if you were filming, say, for a bright daytime. So David Twohy, being a guy who'd worked on special effects movies for about a decade before this happened, really knew how to leverage the limitations he had to make things look fantastic. And indeed, in all three movies, with a couple of provisos on the second one, the special effects are fantastic for this level of movie. These are B pictures. They're not A pictures that cost $200 million to make. They were like $20, $30, $40 million movies. And all of the money is up there on the screen. Then we come to Vin Diesel's Riddick, who is very low-key and casual. And we get a little voiceover at the start of each film, with Riddick setting up the tone of the movie itself. And Riddick is one of those competent people who doesn't have to be flashy about it. In a number of the films, the first one we see it with Johns, we see it in the third one with the mercenaries. But people who are overly confident in their own abilities always end badly in a Riddick movie, because they're bragging, they're not paying attention to what they should be paying attention to, they're trying to make a pissing contest out of every interaction, which is what Johns does in the first movie, which for a certain extent the necromongers do in the second film. And in the third movie, the mercenaries are doing that all the time. Being boastful means you're not paying attention, you're not looking around, you're not understanding changes in your environment and changes in your situation. But in each of the movies, Riddick he watches as much as he acts. In fact, he watches a lot more than he acts. And he understands what's going on, and he studies and he figures things out. And that kind of character needs to be played a certain way in a film. And I think that Vin Diesel does a good job of that. His Riddick is very much different from Dom Toretto in the Fast and Furious movies, even though it does still have some of that Vin Diesel style about it. So Pitch Black, fantastic film. I love the fact that it's got a beautifully multicultural and textured world. The world building in the very literal sense of the planet is fantastic. And it's a good, honest adventure flick. In some ways, you could say it's a space version of a movie like Flight of the Phoenix, the first one, not the second one, which was shit. And it could also be seen as a space version of Sands of the Kalahari. So there are these preceding movies that set up the kind of adventure movie it is. And then David Twohy gives it such an intense infusion of science fiction that it's integral to the plot. Then in 2004, they decided to make a sequel. And this is the misstep of the trilogy. For the second and third film, I did get the director's cuts, and I watched the director's cuts. And for Chronicles of Riddick from 2004, we get an actual introduction by David Twohy explaining that this version of the film has 15 minutes more footage than the theatrical cut, and that there's a lot more history and background for the world building with the necromongers, who are kind of space Nazis with a death cult. You basically physically alter people to become soldiers for their cult, in the same way the child soldiers are in Africa. And they're very stylized. They're basically evangelical space fascists. And the leader of them, played by Colm Fiore, has powers that allow him to manipulate time and space. One of his officers, called Varco, is played by Carl Urban, and he's ambitious. He wants to be Macbeth. And we also get Tandaway Newton playing his wife, who is Lady Macbeth in the piece. So you get a lot of world building there. Riddick ends up on a planet called Helium Prime, which is the home planet of the Imam from the first movie, played by Keith David. And the Imam needs the help of Riddick. You see, when you see the Imam walking through the markets and the streets of Helium Prime, it's a multicultural planet. There are a whole bunch of different belief systems. There are a whole bunch of different human races there. There's Indian people, there's white people, there's Muslims, there's all sorts of different people living in harmony on this planet. And then suddenly a whole bunch of evangelical space fascists invade the planet in skyscraper-sized spaceships with human faces on them. Before that, we find out what's happening with Riddick. He's been hiding out for years on an ice planet, and we see him with dreadlocks and a big beard being hunted by mercenaries who are actually working for the Imam to get Riddick taken to Helium Prime. And we get some good action scenes at this front, which then gives us the time as the second act starts for us to see the Imam and also to understand the Imam's relationship with Riddick, and to give us time to see and understand the crazy culture of the necromongers. There's also another creature called Arian, an air elemental played by Judi Dench, who basically is kind of like a supernatural fairy in a way, and is there for no real purpose in the movie. She's there and she is wispy and does all sorts of predictions and prophecies about what's going to happen, because air elementals can see into the future. But she doesn't actually need to be in the movie. And it's a weird thing. She's kind of at a place where there are all these grounded characters and gritty characters and space fascists and Riddick. Suddenly you get this space fairy played by Judi Dench in the film, and it just doesn't work. So Riddick goes up against the necromongers, and they're the monsters of the movie. First movie and the third movie have more literal monsters, but the monsters in the second film are evangelical space fascists. Not that that could ever happen in the real world. And for me, that makes it a weaker film. It's got some great production values. The production design for the necromongers and for Helium Prime and for everything else you see are solid, but it's not in the purest sense a Riddick film. And we do eventually get Riddick going up against the leader of the necromongers and defeating him, which means that Riddick becomes the king of the necromonger kingdom. So what this movie is basically is Conan the Barbarian in space. Conan eventually becomes King Conan and sits on the throne of an empire. And so Riddick becomes Conan in space. And that was a misstep for the characters. So nothing happened with the movie series for 9 years. Actually, a lot happened in that 9 years. And that's kind of groovy, because Fast and Furious made enormous amounts of money. It made all the money in the world. And so Vin Diesel says, I will do a cameo in Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift if you give me the rights to Riddick as a character and as an intellectual property. And Universal says, sure. And so Vin Diesel spends 9 years getting together the wherewithal to make a third Riddick movie, and he still owns the rights to the character to this day. He and David Twohy worked together. He leveraged his home and basically mortgaged his house to get some of the funding for the third Riddick movie. He went on to play Dom Toretto and do a couple of other interesting side projects and raise a family, do all the other things human beings do. And then in 2013, we get the third movie, Riddick, which is great. The third movie, apart from the first one being groundbreaking and being really fascinating, the third movie is terrific. And I've got the extended cut of it on Blu-ray, which is there. And it is gangbuster good. We find out at the start of the third movie that things don't go well for Riddick being the king of the necromongers. Apart from having 4 women as bed warmers, which is wish fulfillment, one of whom turns out to be an assassin who's unsuccessful, but still not the sort of thing that's going to give you a good night's sleep. Then he gets to deal with Barker, played by Carl Urban, who is the ambitious guy who wants to become the king of the necromongers. Barker will give him a spaceship and send him to Furia, his home planet, because Barker is the one living being who knows where the planet is. So Barker sends him off with one of his assistants, who does a double cross, takes Riddick to another desert planet, and throws him off a cliff. Riddick wakes up with a broken leg, no resources at all, at the bottom of a cliff, on a planet with lots of dangerous creatures on them, one of which is a combination of a monitor lizard and a scorpion. There are a whole bunch of scavenger, large, dappled, dog-like creatures, which end up being really interesting. And there is a secret to this planet, which is very dry. It's got a whole bunch of volcanic mud pools and things like that in the place where Riddick is dropped. And Riddick is pissed off with himself. He got soft being king of the necromongers and having 4 girlfriends in bed every night. And so he gets a readjustment and a reality check. He mends his own broken leg in a very visceral moment. He understands how the creatures in the mud pools work, which are scorpion monitor lizards. He adopts a puppy from these jackal-like dog creatures and raises it as his own companion. So he's got a doggo, which is kind of cool. And the special effects on the doggo are variable a little bit, but still good enough. And because the dog is so cute, we accept it. He survives, and he finds out that there's a greener place in a more verdant area just beyond the mountains in which he has been living. But he has to get past a very large one of these creatures in order to get through a mountain pass to get to this green and verdant land. He manages that and finds out that there's actually a mercenary depot on the planet, and there's an emergency button there where you can call mercenaries to come to the planet and rescue you. He does that, but in doing that, he alerts the mercenaries to who he is, and there's still a large bounty on his head. 2 lots of mercenaries turn up. One very rough and not incredibly disciplined lot, among whom is a guy called Diaz, played by Dave Bautista in an early role. And Bautista does a good job of this. When has Bautista ever been bad in a movie? But these guys want to take Riddick's head back in a box because the bounty is twice as much if he's dead. So they've got this box to preserve his head in. The second lot are a much more professional lot and include actors Matt Nable, an Australian actor who for some reason isn't allowed to have an Australian accent, Katie Sackhoff playing the sniper of the group, and she gets some really nice grace movements in this movie as well, and a group of others. So the 2 spaceships land, and the 2 lots of mercs are antagonistic to each other. Each one of them wants the bounty. Matt Nable's one, his surname was Johns. His lot want Riddick for more personal reasons because he's the father of the bounty hunter in the first movie who died on the planet in pitch black. So the 2 lots of mercs cut a deal with each other that the power cells to run their spaceship are locked away together, and they have a truce until they get Riddick. And then Riddick finds out that the planet too is going to change, that there's enormous rainstorms heading their way, and those rainstorms will wake up the millions and millions of those scorpion monitor lizard creatures that have buried themselves under the ground, and they need to get off the planet before all shit breaks loose with that. And they don't. And the movie has an interesting structure too, because the first chunk is Riddick's survival story, how he learns to survive on the planet. The second lot is the mercenaries who land on the planet, have conflict amongst themselves, and eventually come to a truce in order to hunt Riddick down. And then in the third part, as this storm approaches, Riddick just walks up to their compound and tells them they're all going to have to work together to survive. And that's the third act of the story. This movie has very, very distinct acts. And in the second act, where the characters of the mercenaries is being established, we don't see Vin Diesel at all, really. We give the other actors time to breathe and time to establish their characters, and time to find out the different conflicts between the different characters there, so that when Riddick comes back in, we care about more of the characters than we would if they were just lightly characterized by the movie. And so there's a really interesting structure to this film. And there are a whole bunch of beautiful action set pieces in the third one. The planet itself is distinctly different to the other planets we've seen in the series, even though there are certain similarities in some ways. But David Twohy makes sure that the movie isn't just a retread of the first film. It's very much a different vibe, very much a different dynamic. It's a more sophisticated movie because computer-generated technology's moved on a lot since the first movie was made, and the character of Riddick is much more strongly established, and he's pissed off with himself for the first third of the movie. Monsters are great, action scenes are fantastic, the characters are all established well. Katie Sackhoff and Matt Nable and Dave Bautista do a fantastic job with their characters. There's lots of shooting, lots of disemboweling and beheading of monsters. There's a great scene where Riddick kills one of the mercenaries while he's chained up against a wall. And it's just a solid, gung-ho, full-tilt boogie adrenaline action film, which indeed all 3 of them are. They're just fantastic action films. They work really well. The characters are established well, and David Twohy knows how to do action science fiction. And Vin Diesel's Riddick is a really interesting character, even though Richard B. Riddick sounds like a chartered accountant. by the end of the third movie, you know that Riddick is a name that you've really got to respect. So that's what I got for you this time around. 3 action films, a trilogy that I think is incredibly underrated. And these movies are a ton of fun to watch and a ton of fun to enjoy. And getting back to them was a nice experience. I love how crisp and beautiful the planets are evoked and the world building over the 3 films, allowing for that glitch in the second one. I think they're underrated and underrespected as movies. Now, the third movie cost about $30 million to make, and it made about $100 million. So Vin Diesel got his money back on that one, which I'm glad about. They are making a 4th one. It's in production now, called Riddick Furia, where Riddick does get back to his home planet and finds a new threat to defend his own home planet against. That one's in production right at this moment. So I'm looking forward to that. I want to see where it goes with the movie 11 years after the last movie was made. I'm going to be there. I'm going to have a bum on the seat to watch that one. So let me know if you've seen these movies and whether you like them or not, and what your problem with them is if you don't. I really enjoy them. I think they're honest science fiction action films, and we need more of that kind of thing. Science fiction action films without pretension. I think that's the takeaway of these 3 films. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, give it a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies, by becoming a channel member, or by donating through YouTube. Next up, I've got the Monday video, and I'm going to try something a bit different this time. Maybe jump to a different genre and see what I can do with that. But until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some science fiction movies that people just don't love as much as they should. And I just dropped one, and I'll catch you next time.